A heart once soft can quickly turn into a blade of cold, hard iron when pushed to the breaking point. Witness the sharp edge of revenge as it cuts through the lies and settles the final score. Click subscribe now to see the ultimate price of a broken promise.
My hands were shaking when I finally got the call through. I was sitting in the back of the ambulance, one paramedic wrapping a blood pressure cuff around my arm, and another shining a light into my eyes, and all I could think was that someone needed to know where I was. My husband, Marcus, was 3 states away at a conference in Denver. He had flown out that morning. I had kissed him goodbye at 5 a.m. and told him I would be fine for 4 days on my own. I was very clearly not fine. The car that ran the red light hit me on the driver's side. I never saw it coming. 1 second I was singing along to the radio, and the next there was glass everywhere and a sound so loud it didn't even register as sound anymore. Just pressure. Just white. The paramedic asked me if there was someone local they could contact. I gave them my mother's number without thinking. She lived 11 minutes from the intersection where it happened. Marcus was 2,000 miles away in mid-flight. My mother was 11 minutes away. I heard the phone ring twice before she picked up. "Hello, ma'am. This is Daniel with Cedar Falls EMS. Your daughter Claire has been in a vehicle accident at the intersection of Hartwell and Route 9. We're transporting her to Mercy General. She's conscious and stable, but she has a possible concussion and we need someone to..." Oh, a pause. Then, quieter, away from the phone. "It's about Claire." I heard my father's voice in the background. I couldn't make out words. Then my mother came back on. "How serious is it?" The paramedic looked at me. "She's stable, but she'll need to be evaluated and possibly kept overnight. We'd like a family member to... Can it wait a couple hours?" I stopped breathing. Daniel's expression didn't change, but I watched his jaw tighten slightly. "Ma'am, your daughter is on her way to the emergency room." "Yes, I understand that. It's just that we're in the middle of something with our other daughter right now." "Is Claire in any danger?" I closed my eyes. "She's stable," Daniel said carefully. "Then we'll be there as soon as we can." She hung up. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the ambulance, and I thought about the fact that my mother had just asked a paramedic whether my emergency could wait. And I thought about what could possibly be happening with my younger sister Diane. That was more urgent than this. I found out 3 hours later. Diane had gotten the speeding ticket on the highway coming home from her friend's house. $240. She had been, according to my father, when he finally walked into my hospital room at 9:17 that night, completely beside herself. Crying, hyperventilating, convinced that her insurance rates were going to go up, and that she was going to lose her license, and that her life was essentially over. She was 26 years old. I was lying in a hospital bed with a grade 2 concussion, 2 bruised ribs, and a gash on my forearm that had taken 11 stitches to close. And my parents had spent 3 hours sitting at Diane's kitchen table, talking her down from a $200 speeding ticket. My father walked in and the first thing he said was, "You look okay." Not "Are you okay?" Not "I'm so sorry we weren't here." Just an observation. An assessment. "You look okay," as though that settled things. Marcus had landed in Denver, got my voicemail, and immediately booked the next flight home. He called me from the gate, and I could hear in his voice something tight and controlled that meant he was furious and trying not to show it for my sake. He was my emergency contact. He was always my emergency contact. He was always my emergency contact, but he was in the air when it happened, and the paramedics had needed someone local, and I had given them my mother's number, and that had been my mistake. My nurse that evening was a woman named Patricia, and she was the kindest person I encountered in that entire building. She brought me an extra blanket without my asking, and she checked on me more than she technically needed to, and when my parents finally arrived and my father said, "You look okay," and my mother started telling me about Diane's state of mind, Patricia looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was not pity exactly. It was more like recognition, like she had seen this before. My mother sat down in the chair beside my bed and explained that Diane had really been struggling lately. Anxiety. A bad breakup earlier in the year. She was fragile. The ticket had just been the final straw for her. I had 11 stitches in my arm. I did not say this out loud. I lay there and I listened to my mother explain my sister's emotional landscape to me while I was in a hospital bed, and I nodded, and I said, I understand. And I hated myself a little for both of those things. What I didn't say was that I had been awake since 5 a.m., that I had sat in that ambulance alone and given them my mother's number because she was 11 minutes away and I was scared, and I just wanted someone who knew me to be there. That Patricia had brought me a blanket because she could see I was cold and no one who loved me had thought to ask. Marcus landed at midnight. He came straight from the airport. He walked into my room still in his conference clothes, a rolling suitcase behind him. And he crossed the room and put both arms around me so carefully, like I was something he was afraid of breaking, and I cried for the first time since the whole thing happened. Not because of the accident, not because of the ribs or the stitches or the headache that had been sitting behind my eyes for hours. I cried because he had flown home from Denver and my parents had driven 11 minutes, and one of those things had happened faster than the other. He looked at my parents once, briefly. He didn't say anything to them. He pulled the second chair up next to my bed, and he sat there and held my hand. And my parents left around 1 a.m. And that was the night I understood something I had probably known for a long time. That was 14 months ago. I want to tell you about the 14 months in between, because this story is not really about the accident. The accident was just the moment everything became impossible to ignore. I am an accountant. I have worked at the same firm for 6 years, made partner last spring, and I am, by most measures, stable. Financially stable. Financially stable. The kind of stable that other people in my family call upon when they need things. Diane is a receptionist at a hair salon. She is funny and charming, and she has never once in her adult life paid her own car insurance. My parents have covered it since she turned 16, and they never stopped. They also covered her cell phone plan until she was 24, helped her move 3 times in 4 years, and co-signed on her apartment lease when her credit score wasn't high enough. None of these things would bother me if they were simply things parents did out of love. But here is what I know. When my transmission died 3 years ago, and I asked my father if I could borrow $800 for 2 weeks until my next paycheck cleared, he said he would have to check with my mother, and then called me back the next day to say they were a little tight right now. 2 weeks later, Diane needed a new laptop because hers had broken, and they bought her one the same afternoon she asked. I had stopped keeping a running tally by then. It was too exhausting and it made me feel small. But I noticed. I always noticed. After the accident, Marcus suggested gently that I think about adjusting my relationship with my parents. He was not harsh about it. He never is. He just said, at some point during my recovery, when I was sitting on the couch with an ice pack on my ribs, and my mother had called to ask if I could transfer money to help cover Diane's increased insurance premium from the speeding ticket. He just said, Claire, do you hear what you're doing right now? I was filling out the transfer on my phone. I had a concussion. I was still getting headaches every afternoon. And I was sending my sister $180 to cover the premium increase from the ticket that had kept my parents from coming to the hospital. I put my phone down. I didn't send the money. My mother called back 20 minutes later and I let it go to voicemail. Then I turned to Marcus and said, I think I've been doing this for a long time. He said, I know. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no single confrontation. No screaming match in a driveway. What there was distance. I stopped transferring money. I stopped answering the calls that came in right before a bill was due. I started saying things like, I can't right now, instead of, let me see what I can do. And I stopped apologizing for saying them. Diane texted me in November asking to borrow $300 for her electricity bill. I told her I wasn't in a position to help. She sent back 3 messages in a row, each one escalating slightly, ending with, you know what? Fine. I'll figure it out like I always have to. I almost laughed at that. Like she always has to. As though the last decade of her financial history was a solo endeavor. My mother called 2 days later. She did not ask how I was doing. She said she wanted to talk about Diane. I said I'd heard from Diane already. She said she was concerned that I was pulling away from the family. That I had seemed different since the accident. That she hoped I wasn't letting bitterness change who I was. I thought about Patricia and the blanket. I said, "Mom, I'm going to need to call you back." I did not call her back that day. Here is what I want you to understand about that period. I was not angry all the time. That is the part nobody tells you about in these stories. It wasn't rage. It wasn't bitterness. It was mostly just quiet. Like a noise I had been hearing for so long I'd stopped registering it. And then one day someone pointed it out, and suddenly I couldn't unhear it. And now the house felt different. I grieved it actually. I know that sounds strange, but I grieved the idea of the family I had thought I had. The one where my mother would drop everything and drive 11 minutes when I needed her. I had believed in that family more or less for 31 years. Letting go of the belief hurt in a way I hadn't expected. Marcus was patient through all of it. He let me talk when I needed to, and he didn't push when I didn't. He took me to dinner on the 6-month anniversary of the accident, and at some point during dessert, he said, "I want you to know that whatever you decide about your family, I'm with you. But I also want you to know that you don't owe them a performance of being okay when you're not." I have thought about that sentence almost every day since. What I decided, eventually, was not to cut them off. I am not that kind of person, and I don't think that would have helped me anyway. What I decided was to stop pretending, stop performing, stop being the version of myself that transferred money and answered calls before the words were even out and said of course, when every part of me wanted to say something else. I started showing up as I actually was, tired when I was tired, unavailable when I was unavailable. I stopped filling silence with reassurances. I stopped over-explaining my decisions. I said no sometimes without a reason attached. Just no. It made my mother uncomfortable. I could hear it in the way her calls got shorter. The questions more pointed. "Are you okay? You seem distant. Are you and Marcus having problems?" Because in her framework, the only reason I would stop being endlessly available was if something was wrong with me. The thought that something had always been slightly wrong with the arrangement apparently did not occur to her. The moment that changed everything publicly happened in March. My firm holds an annual dinner every spring. It's a formal thing, not enormous, maybe 90 people in the ballroom of a hotel downtown. Clients, partners, spouses. That year, I was being recognized for bringing in the largest new account of the year, a regional manufacturing group that had taken me 7 months to land. Marcus was my date. My parents had been invited because I had, out of old habit, mentioned it to my mother in January, and she had expressed interest in coming. I should have uninvited them. In retrospect, that was the moment to do it, but I didn't, and they came, and they sat at a table near the back with Marcus's parents, who are lovely people and who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The recognition portion of the evening was not long. My managing partner said some kind words. I walked to the small podium and I gave the short speech I had prepared. It was professional and warm, and I had written it 3 weeks earlier when I was still planning to deliver exactly that speech and nothing else. But I had also spent those 3 weeks thinking. I had been thinking about the night in the ambulance, about Daniel the paramedic and his carefully neutral expression when my mother asked if my emergency could wait, about lying in that hospital room watching the door for 3 hours, about Patricia and the blanket, about Diane's $240 ticket and the $180 insurance premium I had almost sent while sitting on my couch with a concussion. And standing at that podium, looking out at 90 people in a nice hotel ballroom, I made a decision. I gave my prepared speech first, word for word, exactly as written. I thanked my managing partner and my colleagues and the clients, and I said all the right things. And then I paused, and I said, I also want to take a moment to recognize the people who shaped how I think about showing up. My mother, from what Marcus told me later, sat up a little straighter. I learned a lot this past year, I said. I was in a car accident last January, nothing life-threatening, which I'm grateful for. But I was alone in that ambulance, and someone asked if there was a family member nearby who could come to the hospital. I paused. There was. She was 11 minutes away. She asked the paramedic if it could wait a couple hours. The room was quiet. She was helping my sister process a speeding ticket. A different kind of quiet. I want to be clear about why I'm sharing this. Not because I'm angry anymore. I'm actually not. I'm sharing it because for a long time I confused loyalty with availability. I thought being a good daughter meant always saying yes, always sending the money, always being reachable. And I learned this year, in a fairly concrete way, that the people I was most available to were not always the people who would show up for me. I looked at Marcus, who was looking back at me with an expression I can't fully describe. Steady, proud, a little worried. My husband flew home from Denver at midnight to sit next to my hospital bed. My nurse brought me a blanket because she could see I was cold. Those are the people I want to honor tonight, the ones who show up. I stepped back from the podium. The applause was generous and slightly confused, the way applause is when people aren't entirely sure what they just witnessed. Marcus found me 30 seconds later and took my hand. My mother did not find me until 20 minutes after that. When she did, she was very controlled, which is how I knew she was not okay. Her voice had that specific flatness it gets when she is furious, but in public, she said, "That was completely inappropriate." I said, "I know you see it that way." She said, "You humiliated us in front of your colleagues." I said, "I told a true story." She said something else after that and I let her finish, and then I said, "Mom, this isn't the right place for this conversation. I'll call you this week." She left before the dessert course. My father stopped by Marcus on his way out and said something Marcus won't fully repeat, just that it was not kind. Marcus thanked him politely for coming and held the door. Here's what happened in the following weeks. Diane texted me 14 times in the 3 days after the dinner. I read all of them and responded to none of them immediately. When I finally replied, it was a single message. "I love you. I'm not going to argue about this." She did not respond. My mother called every day for a week. I let most of them go to voicemail. I listened to every message. They progressed from hurt to angry to something that was almost, in one of them, close to reflective. In the 6th message she said, "I know we weren't there as fast as we should have been. I want to talk about that." I called her back after that one. It was not an easy conversation. It was long and circular, and there were several points where I thought one of us might hang up. But I stayed in it, and she stayed in it, and by the end of something had shifted. Not fixed, not resolved in the way that would make a clean ending to this story, but shifted. She said, "I didn't realize how much we'd been leaning on you." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know why Diane's struggles always felt more urgent." I said, "I don't know either, but I need you to think about that, because I can't keep being the person who is always okay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're right. That's not fair." Those 4 words were not everything. But they were not nothing. My father has been harder. He's proud in a way that makes honesty difficult, and I think the dinner embarrassed him in a way he has not found language for yet. We are civil. We are careful with each other. I am patient because I've decided to be, not because I feel obligated to be. That difference matters more than I can explain. Diane and I had lunch last month. She was quieter than usual and so was I. And at some point she said, "I didn't know you felt this way. Like, I knew things weren't equal, but I didn't know you were keeping track." I said, "I wasn't keeping track. I was just living it." She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about the hospital thing a lot." I didn't say anything. She said, I was having a meltdown over a stupid ticket and you were in an ambulance. I've thought about that so many times since the dinner. She finally looked at me. I'm sorry, Claire. I really am. That one landed differently than my mother's acknowledgement had. Maybe because Diane had never apologized to me for anything before, not in any way that felt real. I sat with it for a moment and then I said, "Thank you, that means something." We split the check evenly. It was the first time that it ever happened. Marcus and I are fine, better than fine actually, because somewhere in the middle of all of this we got very clear about the life we want to build. We're looking at houses in a neighborhood about 30 minutes from my parents instead of the 12 minutes away we've been considering before. Not to punish anyone. Just because 30 minutes feels like the right amount of space for where we are right now. Last week, my mother called to tell me that Diane had gotten a new job, better pay, and she had set up her own insurance and her own phone plan. And my mother said it like she was relaying news, but there was something underneath it that I think was meant for me, an acknowledgement without being an acknowledgement. I said I was happy for Diane. I meant it. Some endings are not clean. Some things that break don't go back together exactly as they were. And I've made my peace with that. What I have instead is a life where I don't dread certain phone numbers, where I don't mentally calculate what a call might cost me before I pick up. Where, when I am sick or scared, the right person already knows to come. Marcus is still my emergency contact. He always was. I think I just needed to stop being everyone else's. I used to think that being needed was the same thing as being loved. For a long time, those two things felt identical to me. My phone rang and I answered. Someone was short on money and I transferred it. Someone was overwhelmed and I showed up. I built my entire sense of place in my family around being the one who could be counted on, and I mistook that role for a relationship. What I learned, slowly and then all at once, is that availability without reciprocity is not a relationship. It is a system, and I had been a very efficient part of a system that only moved in one direction. The accident didn't change my family. I want to be clear about that. My parents did not become different people because of one night in a hospital room. What it changed was me, and specifically what I was willing to keep pretending not to see. There is a certain kind of clarity that comes from lying alone in an emergency room waiting for someone who is 11 minutes away and choosing not to come. You can explain it away once, you can find reasons, but when you are lying there with stitches in your arm and a headache behind your eyes, and you already know, before the door opens, that the person walking through it will not be who you needed, something in you quietly stops negotiating. That is not bitterness. I want to name that correctly because I think bitterness and clarity are often confused. Bitterness holds on. It rehearses. It wants an audience. What I felt was quieter than that. It was more like finally reading a contract I had been signing for years without looking at the terms. The choices we make about who gets our time, our money, our energy, those choices accumulate. They become the shape of a life. I had been making choices that prioritized everyone's comfort except my own for so long that I had stopped recognizing it as a choice. It felt like personality. It felt like just who I was. And the most important thing I did in the year after that accident was understand that it wasn't who I was. It was what I had learned to do in order to feel safe in a family where being useful was the closest thing to being valued. Changing that required a kind of courage I hadn't expected. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up when you let a call go to voicemail and sit with the discomfort of that. When you say, "I can't right now," and don't fill the silence with an apology. When you stop making yourself smaller so that other people don't have to feel the size of what they've taken. Marcus flew home from Denver at midnight. He didn't ask whether it was convenient. He didn't weigh my situation against anything else happening in his life. He just came. That is what it looks like when someone has decided that you matter. Not the words. The behavior, consistently, over time, when it costs something. I think about that a lot now. I think about how the most important things I know about integrity, I learned not from a speech or a lesson, but from watching what people do when showing up is inconvenient. That is the only honest test. Anyone can be generous when it's easy. What reveals character is the moment when there is something else to do, somewhere easier to be, and a person chooses you anyway. I chose myself, eventually. And that made all the difference.